the Star of Bethlehem. 2,000 years ago, something moved across the night sky over the Middle East, and a group of men who spent their entire lives studying the stars saw it, packed up their lives, and started walking. They walked for months, maybe longer. They crossed deserts. They crossed borders. They carried gold. They carried spices worth more than most people in their villages would ever see. And they weren't chasing a rumor. They weren't chasing a legend. They were chasing a light. And here's the part that has haunted scholars, pastors, astronomers, and honest Bible readers for centuries. What did they actually see? Because if you stop and really think about it, the story doesn't behave like a normal story. A star that moves, a star that stops, a star that leads, a star that points down at a specific house in a specific village on a specific night. Stars don't do that. Stars stay put. Stars follow the same slow arc across the sky that they've been following since the first human looked up. So what was this thing? Was it a comet? Was it a supernova? Was it a rare planetary lineup? Was it a miracle? Was it something the human eye can't fully explain even now with all our satellites and telescopes and math? And here's the deeper question, the one nobody really wants to sit with. If God used a light in the sky to announce the birth of his son, why did only a handful of foreigners notice it? Why didn't the priests in Jerusalem see it? Why didn't King Herod know until strangers told him? Why did the shepherds get angels, the Magi get a star, and everyone else get nothing at all? Something is going on in this story. Something bigger than a Christmas card. Something bigger than a nativity scene. And if we're honest, most of us grew up hearing this story so many times that we stopped asking questions about it. We just accepted the star, the camels, the three kings, the manger, and moved on. But the Bible actually says very little about the star. And what it does say is strange enough to keep astronomers arguing about it 2,000 years later. So tonight, let's slow down. Let's open the actual text. Let's look at the real history. Let's look at what the sky was actually doing during the years Jesus was likely born. Let's separate what the Bible says from what tradition says. Let's separate fact from folklore, and let's ask the question honestly. What was the Star of Bethlehem? And more importantly, what is God trying to tell us through it, even now, sitting in our living rooms, 2,000 years later, still looking up at the same sky those men looked up at? Let's start with what the Bible actually says, because most of what people think they know about the Star of Bethlehem doesn't come from the Bible at all. It comes from Christmas cards, Sunday school felt boards, Hollywood movies, and hymns. The actual biblical account of the star is found in one place, one gospel, one short passage. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2. That's it. Mark doesn't mention it. Luke doesn't mention it. John doesn't mention it. Only Matthew, and Matthew doesn't give us a whole lot. He tells us that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, and they asked a question that must have stopped the whole city cold. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star when it rose and have come to worship him. That's what they said. We saw his star. They didn't say we saw a comet. They didn't say we saw a supernova. They didn't say we saw a strange light. They said we saw his star, which means whatever they saw, they connected it to a person. A specific person. A king. And not just any king. The King of the Jews. Now stop right there. These men were not Jews. They weren't from Israel. They weren't reading the Torah at the local synagogue. They were from the East, which most scholars believe meant somewhere in the region of ancient Persia or Babylon, maybe even further. And yet somehow, out there in a foreign country, watching the night sky, they connected a light in the heavens to the birth of a Jewish king. How? How did they know? That's already a mystery, and we're only 2 verses in. Matthew keeps going. Herod hears about this and gets deeply disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him, because Herod was not a man you wanted to disturb. Herod was ruthless. Herod was paranoid. Herod had already killed members of his own family to protect his throne. And now a group of foreign scholars shows up in his capital city, asking about a rival king. Herod calls together the chief priests and the scribes. He asks them where the Messiah was supposed to be born. And they answer him from the prophet Micah, in Bethlehem of Judea, a small town, easy to overlook, but written about 700 years earlier by a prophet who said a ruler would come from there. Herod then quietly calls the wise men. He asks them exactly when the star appeared, and then he sends them to Bethlehem with a chilling instruction. Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. Of course, he had no intention of worshiping him. We'll get to that. But here's the next part Matthew tells us. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them, until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. Read that slowly. The star went before them. It moved, and then it came to rest. It stopped over a specific place. This is not how stars behave. This is not how planets behave. This is not how comets behave. Something is going on here that our normal categories don't explain. And Matthew doesn't try to explain it. He just tells you what happened, and then he moves on. That's it. That's the entire biblical account of the Star of Bethlehem. A few verses, no long description, no scientific explanation, no astronomer's notes, just a light in the sky, a group of foreign scholars, a paranoid king, and a baby in a house in a small town. And yet, from those few verses, we've built 2,000 years of tradition, art, music, and speculation. So before we go any further, let's clear the deck. Let's throw out the myths and get back to what the Bible actually says. First myth, there were 3 wise men. The Bible never says that. Matthew never gives us a number. We've assumed 3 because there were 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh. But there could have been 2. There could have been 10. There could have been a whole caravan. In the ancient world, traveling long distances with expensive goods usually meant traveling in groups with servants and guards, because bandits waited on those roads. So picture a small party of scholars, not 3 lonely men on camels. Second myth, they were kings. The Bible never calls them kings. It calls them magi. Magi was a word for a class of learned men, often astronomers, sometimes advisors to royal courts, especially in Persia and Babylon. They were scholars. They were watchers of the sky. They were readers of ancient texts. Some of them were probably descendants of a tradition that went all the way back to the time of Daniel. Remember, Daniel was carried off to Babylon centuries earlier, and Daniel became one of the leading wise men of Babylon. Daniel wrote about the coming of a Messiah, and Daniel's writings would have been preserved and studied by generations of magi long after he died. So it's possible, and many scholars believe this, that these men were part of a tradition that had been watching for a specific king for hundreds of years. That changes everything. They didn't just stumble across the star. They had been waiting. Third myth, they arrived at the manger. They didn't. Luke tells us about the shepherds coming to the manger the night Jesus was born. But Matthew tells us the wise men arrived later. How much later? We don't know exactly, but we can make a reasonable guess. When Herod later ordered the murder of the children of Bethlehem, he ordered the killing of every boy 2 years old and under, according to the time he had learned from the wise men. So the star had appeared up to 2 years before their arrival. By the time the Magi got to Bethlehem, Jesus was not a newborn in a manger. He was a child. Matthew even uses a different Greek word. When the shepherds came, Luke uses a word for infant. When the Magi came, Matthew uses a word for young child. And Matthew says they found him in a house, not a stable. So the picture in most nativity scenes is wrong. The shepherds and the wise men were not there on the same night. They were separated by months, possibly by more than a year. These little details matter because they tell us something important about the star. The star did not appear the night Jesus was born. It appeared earlier, maybe when he was conceived, maybe when he was born, maybe sometime close to it. But by the time the Magi finished their long journey, Jesus was no longer a newborn. And that means whatever the star was, it wasn't a one-night flash in the sky. It was something that appeared and lasted and could be seen and studied across a long stretch of time. That rules out some theories immediately, and it opens the door to others. So what could it have been? Let's walk through the leading theories that scientists, historians, and Bible scholars have wrestled with for centuries. The first theory is the comet theory. Comets have always fascinated people. They appear out of nowhere. They trail across the sky. They seem to point in a certain direction. In ancient times, comets were often seen as signs from God or the gods, sometimes signs of a great birth, sometimes signs of a coming disaster. The most famous comet in history is Halley's Comet, which returns roughly every 76 years. And Halley's Comet did appear in the sky around 12 B.C. Some scholars have wondered if that was the Star of Bethlehem. But there's a problem. 12 B.C. is too early. Most historians place the birth of Jesus somewhere between 6 B.C. and 4 B.C., based on when Herod died and other historical markers. So Halley's Comet doesn't fit the timing. And there's a deeper problem. In the ancient world, comets were almost always seen as bad omens, signs of war, signs of death, signs of the fall of kings, not the rise of kings. So it seems unlikely that a group of trained magi would look at a comet and say, "A king has been born." Their whole tradition would have told them the opposite. The comet theory doesn't quite work. The second theory is the supernova theory. A supernova is a star that explodes at the end of its life. For a short time, it can shine brighter than anything else in the sky, sometimes bright enough to see during the day. Chinese astronomers were meticulous record keepers. They wrote down every unusual thing they saw in the sky for thousands of years, and there is a record of a bright new star around 5 B.C. that stayed visible for about 70 days. The timing fits. The visibility fits. But there's a problem here too. A supernova stays fixed in the sky. It doesn't move. It doesn't lead travelers. It doesn't stop over a house. So if it was a supernova, Matthew's description of the star going before them and coming to rest is either symbolic or something else was going on. Still, many astronomers think a supernova may have played some role. The third theory, and this is the one that has gotten the most attention in the last few decades, is the planetary conjunction theory. In the years right around the likely birth of Jesus, something remarkable was happening in the sky. Planets were lining up in unusual and meaningful ways. In 7 B.C., there was a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. That happened 3 times in a single year. That is extremely rare. And to ancient astronomers, every piece of that had meaning. Jupiter was known as the king planet, the planet of royalty. Saturn was sometimes associated with the Jewish people, and Pisces was sometimes associated with the land of Israel. So imagine what a magus would see. The king planet and the planet of the Jews meeting 3 times in the constellation of Israel. Any trained astronomer of the ancient world would sit up straight and say, something is happening. And then, just a couple of years later, in around 3 or 2 B.C., there was an even more striking event. Jupiter, the king planet, came into conjunction with Venus, the bright planet of love and beauty, in the constellation of Leo, the lion. The lion was the symbol of the tribe of Judah, and Jupiter met Venus so closely that, to the naked eye, they would have merged into a single dazzling point of light, brighter than anything else in the sky. Some astronomers believe this could be the star. And then there's the strangest part. Because of the way Jupiter and the Earth move in their orbits, Jupiter sometimes appears to stop in the sky. It's called retrograde motion. Jupiter moves in one direction, then slows down, and then appears to stand still for a while before moving in the other direction. If a Magi group was tracking Jupiter, and Jupiter appeared to stop in the sky right over the region of Bethlehem, that could match Matthew's description of the star coming to rest. But even with all this, there are still problems, because planets don't hover over a specific house. They hover over regions. So Matthew's language is either very poetic, or something more is happening than pure astronomy can explain. And that leads to the fourth theory, the miracle theory. Maybe it wasn't a comet. Maybe it wasn't a supernova. Maybe it wasn't just a conjunction. Maybe it was something God created for a moment, something the human eye could see, but which didn't follow the ordinary laws of stars and planets. This is the view many Bible-believing Christians have held for centuries. The star was a sign, a supernatural sign, as unusual as an angel appearing to shepherds, as unusual as a virgin conceiving, as unusual as God becoming flesh. And if you already believe those things, then a moving, stopping star doesn't seem like the biggest problem in the story. And here's a thought worth sitting with. What if the answer is not either or, but both and? What if God used real astronomy, real planets, real events in the sky that a trained magus would recognize to start their journey? And then, when they got close, he used a special sign, something more targeted, to lead them to the exact house. God using ordinary means to start the story, and extraordinary means to finish it. That pattern actually fits how God often works throughout Scripture. He uses real weather, real armies, real journeys, and then adds a supernatural touch when it matters most. The Star of Bethlehem may have been both a real astronomical event and a real supernatural sign. That would explain why the Magi came at all, and why they ended up at the right door. But here's what really haunts me about this story. All of Jerusalem should have seen the same sky those Magi saw. Everyone in Israel had access to the same scriptures. The priests knew the prophecy of Micah. They answered Herod's question in a heartbeat. Bethlehem, they knew, but they didn't go. Think about that. The Magi traveled for months across dangerous country to worship a king they had never met. And the priests, sitting a few miles from Bethlehem, wouldn't even walk down the road to check. The foreigners came from the east. The locals stayed home. This is one of the most quietly heartbreaking details in the entire Christmas story. And it says something not just about them. It says something about us, because it's very possible to know the Bible and miss Jesus. It's very possible to answer Bible questions correctly and never walk out your door to meet him. The priests had knowledge. The Magi had hunger. Knowledge without hunger doesn't move you. It just makes you feel smart while the caravan passes by. This pattern shows up all through Scripture. People who should have recognized God often missed him. People who had no business recognizing him often ran toward him. The Roman centurion at the cross saw more clearly than the religious leaders who had watched Jesus for 3 years. The Samaritan woman at the well believed before the disciples fully understood. The tax collectors and prostitutes were entering the kingdom, while the Pharisees stood outside, arguing about who deserved to be in it. And the Magi, foreigners, outsiders, people who studied the wrong books by the standards of Jerusalem, followed a star and found the king. And here's a quiet question worth asking yourself. If God sent a sign to your life right now, would you follow it, or would you look up, notice it, and go back to whatever you were doing? We like to think we would be the Magi in this story. But if we're honest, most of us would probably be the priests. We would know the answer, and we would not move. Let's talk about who the Magi actually were, because this matters more than most people realize. In the ancient world, Magi were not simple stargazers looking up at random points of light. They were a highly educated class of scholars, mostly from Persia and Babylon. They served in royal courts. They advised kings. They were the astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers of their day. They studied the movements of the planets. They kept detailed records of eclipses. They had libraries. They had traditions passed down for generations. And they took the sky seriously because in the ancient world, the sky was seen as a kind of language. Every unusual event meant something, and the Magi were the ones trained to read that language. Now here is where the story gets even more interesting. As I mentioned earlier, the prophet Daniel spent most of his adult life in Babylon. Daniel was one of the wisest men in the Babylonian Empire. Daniel had prophetic dreams. Daniel interpreted the dreams of kings. Daniel wrote about a coming ruler, a Messiah, and even gave a rough timeline. And Daniel became the head of the wise men of Babylon, which almost certainly included the Magi tradition. So long after Daniel died, his writings would have been preserved. His prophecies would have been studied. The Magi of later centuries would have looked up at the sky, knowing that Daniel had said something specific about the coming of a great king. Now imagine, hundreds of years after Daniel, a new generation of Magi looking at strange lights in the sky. Jupiter meeting Saturn, Jupiter meeting Venus, planets moving through constellations associated with kings and with the Jewish people. And imagine one of them pulling out an old scroll connected to Daniel and saying, "This is it. This is the sign. This is the king Daniel wrote about." Suddenly, the Magi story stops looking like a random adventure. It starts looking like the culmination of a centuries-long watch. A group of scholars, generation after generation, watching the sky, reading the ancient prophecies, waiting for the sign. And then, one night, the sign came, and they got up, packed their bags, and went. That means the Christmas story didn't start when Jesus was born. It started centuries earlier, with a Jewish exile named Daniel faithfully serving God in a foreign land, planting the seeds of a prophecy that a group of foreigners would eventually follow all the way to Bethlehem. God plays a long game. We like quick stories. God writes stories across generations. What Daniel did 500 years earlier, in his obedience under pressure, mattered on the night the Magi lit their lamps and started walking. Don't ever think what you do doesn't matter. Daniel had no idea that scholars, centuries later, would be reading his writings under the stars. On the very night they decided to travel toward a baby in a barn town. Your obedience today may be planting a seed God will use 200 years from now. Now let's talk about the gifts, because the gifts the Magi brought are one of the strangest parts of the story if you really stop to think about it. Gold, frankincense, myrrh. Children in Christmas plays hold them up in shiny boxes without ever wondering what they meant. But every one of these gifts is loaded with meaning. Gold was the gift of a king. Gold was for royalty. Gold was for palaces and crowns and thrones. Gold said, "I see who you are. I see that you are a ruler. I see that you will reign." So the first gift, laid at the feet of a small child in a modest house, in a small town, said, "You are a king." Frankincense was different. Frankincense was used in worship. It was burned in temples. It was used by priests. It was offered to God. So the second gift said, "You are not just a king. You are holy. You are the one before whom incense should rise. You belong in the temple, at the very center, where worship is offered. And then myrrh. And here is where the story goes quiet, because myrrh was used to embalm the dead. Myrrh was used to prepare bodies for burial. Myrrh was the smell of grief. It was the smell of loss. It was the smell of the tomb. And this was given to a small child. Imagine his mother watching. Imagine Mary, still young, still processing everything that had happened, receiving a gift that whispered of a funeral. Some scholars think Mary tucked these gifts away and used them later, maybe even to fund their escape into Egypt, which we'll get to in a moment. But even without knowing that, the meaning was clear. 3 gifts, 3 truths: king, God, sacrifice. The Magi may or may not have understood all of it, but God did. And every gift was a prophecy. This is one of the reasons the Christmas story cannot be reduced to sentimentality. Because right there, in the middle of the most tender scene in the Bible, someone lays down myrrh, and the shadow of the cross falls across the manger. The same Jesus who was born to be worshipped was born to die. The same king who received gold would one day wear a crown of thorns. The same holy child who received frankincense would one day be nailed to a piece of wood outside the city. The gifts told the whole gospel before Jesus could even speak a word. And here's another quiet thought worth sitting with. The Magi didn't come empty-handed. They didn't come to worship Jesus and offer him only their opinions. They brought their treasure. They brought their best, and they laid it down. Worship in the Bible almost always involves a laying down of something. Shepherds laid down their fear. Mary laid down her plans. Joseph laid down his reputation. The Magi laid down their gold. And the question worth asking is, what have you laid down? Because you can sing every Christmas song, put lights on every window, know every verse about the birth of Jesus, and still be holding tightly to your own gold. The Magi's example is not simply that they came, it's that they came and gave. Worship without surrender is just a show. Now let's talk about Herod. Because you can't understand the Star of Bethlehem without understanding the man who tried to snuff it out. Herod the Great was not a good king. History remembers him for 2 things: his building projects and his brutality. He was a builder. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem into one of the wonders of the ancient world. He built fortresses. He built cities. He built palaces. Some of them are still standing today, more or less, and archaeologists still study them. But he was also paranoid, cruel, and dangerous. He killed his own wife. He killed his own sons. The Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus reportedly joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son, because Herod, being loosely observant of Jewish customs, wouldn't slaughter a pig, but he had no problem slaughtering his own children. That was Herod. That was the man sitting on the throne when the Magi walked into Jerusalem asking about a newborn king. And now, imagine you're Herod. You've spent your entire life clawing your way to power. You've crushed rivals. You've bribed emperors. You've built a kingdom. And one afternoon, a group of foreign scholars comes into your palace and asks a simple question that hits you like a punch in the stomach. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Not born to become king, born already king. Herod's whole world tilted. Everything he had worked for, everything he had killed for, seemed threatened by a baby he had never seen, in a town he barely thought about. So he did what men like Herod do. He pretended. He smiled. He called the Magi in quietly. He pretended to want to worship. He asked them exactly when they had first seen the star. And then he sent them off, telling them to send word back. And when the Magi didn't come back, warned in a dream to return home by another route, Herod's fear turned to rage. Matthew tells us, he sent soldiers to Bethlehem and ordered every boy 2 years old and under to be killed. We don't know the exact number. Bethlehem was small. Many scholars think it may have been between 10 and 20 children, maybe a few dozen at most. but every one of them was somebody's son. Every mother in that town lost something that day, and the light that had shone so brightly in the sky was now shining over a village of grief. This is one of the darkest passages in the Christmas story, and we skip over it too fast because it doesn't fit the Christmas card. But the Bible doesn't shy away from it. Matthew even quotes the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Why does Matthew include this? Because the coming of the king was not soft. Because from the very beginning, evil recognized that its time was short. Because the star that pointed to a savior also pointed to a war. And God was stepping into a real world with real darkness, real violence, and real tears. And here is something worth noticing. God did not stop Herod's cruelty by force. God did not send lightning. God did not send angels with swords. God warned Joseph in a dream. Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt. And they went. The Son of God became a refugee. Mary and Joseph fled across borders with a small child, running for their lives. And where did they go? Egypt. The same Egypt that had once enslaved Israel. The same Egypt from which God had once called his people. And Matthew quotes another prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. God was rewriting the story. What Egypt had once been for Israel, Egypt was now for Jesus. A place of refuge, a place of waiting, and eventually a place from which the true Savior would come. Every detail of this story is layered. Every event fits into a larger pattern, and none of it was random. Now let's step back and ask a very hard question. Why a star? Of all the ways God could have announced the birth of his son, why choose a light in the sky that only a handful of foreign scholars would understand? Think about it. God could have shaken the earth. God could have split the heavens open. God could have sent a booming voice across every nation. God had done things like that in the Old Testament. But for the birth of Jesus, he chose something quieter. He chose a star. And here's the thing about stars. Everyone sees them, but not everyone reads them. Thousands of people looked up at the same sky the Magi looked at. Thousands saw the same lights, but only the Magi understood. Only the ones who had been watching, waiting, and studying could recognize what God was saying. And here's a lesson tucked inside that. God often speaks in ways that require attention. He doesn't always shout. Sometimes his loudest words are whispered in a language only those who are listening can understand. The star was in the sky for everyone, but only some noticed. Jesus was in the world for everyone, but only some believed. God was speaking through his Son to every human being on earth, but only some heard. This pattern hasn't changed. Today, God is still speaking. Through creation, through Scripture, through the still small voice of conscience. Through the deep hunger every human being feels for something more than food and money and pleasure. But you have to be looking up. You have to be paying attention. You have to be like the Magi, not like the priests. And here's another thought. God chose to speak to the Magi in the language they already understood. They were astronomers, so he wrote his announcement in the sky, because that's where they were looking. That is a stunning picture of grace. God does not demand that we come to him in a language we don't speak. He often begins where we are. He meets scientists in science. He meets doctors in medicine. He meets farmers in fields. He meets fishermen on boats. He meets shepherds in fields at night. He meets tax collectors at their tables. He meets outsiders on their long walks home. And he meets us in whatever ordinary place we're standing right now. God will use whatever language you already know to start a conversation with you. And once you follow that first small clue, he will lead you further. The star was never the destination. The star was the invitation. What mattered was not the light. What mattered was the child at the end of the road. God may be using something in your life right now the way He used the star. A book, a conversation, a song, a strange coincidence, a sudden ache in your soul. A memory that won't leave you alone. It might not seem like a big thing, but the Magi's star didn't look like the biggest event in world history either. It just looked like a light. Sometimes the invitations of God look small at first, but they lead to Jesus. Let's talk about what the Magi saw when they finally arrived. We picture a stable. We picture straw. We picture a manger. But by the time the Magi walked into Bethlehem, Jesus was likely no longer in a stable. Matthew says they came into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother. A house, not a barn. A real ordinary house in a real ordinary town, with a young mother and a small child. No armed guards, no palace, no announcement, no fanfare, just a door, just a family, just a child. And Matthew says, and they fell down and worshipped Him. Imagine that scene. These highly educated foreigners, dressed in the finest robes of their kingdom, riding into a town of maybe a few hundred people. They must have looked out of place, like a stretch limo pulling into a small farm road. And yet the moment they saw the child, they fell down. Not just bowed, not just nodded politely, fell down. That word in Greek means full physical worship, face on the ground. This was worship, not sightseeing. And here's what's stunning. They had traveled for months. They had crossed deserts. They had probably imagined all kinds of things about what they would find at the end of the star. Maybe a prince in a palace. Maybe a king surrounded by servants. Maybe a young man being trained for a throne. What they found was a toddler in a working-class home with a carpenter for a stepfather and a young mother from a small village. And they didn't hesitate. They didn't reconsider. They didn't ask, "Are you sure this is the right house?" They saw. They knelt. They gave. These men had learned something that the priests in Jerusalem never learned. That God does not always come in the packaging we expect. God often shows up smaller than we imagine, quieter than we expect, and in a place we didn't think worth checking. Bethlehem, a small town, a small house, a small child. And yet, at that moment, the greatest king in the universe was in that room, and only 3 or 4 people knew. That is often how God works. He does His greatest work in the smallest rooms. He does His mightiest miracles in the quietest. He starts kingdoms in mangers. He grows churches in living rooms. He changes the world through unknown mothers, unknown fathers, unknown pastors, unknown missionaries, unknown teachers, unknown grandparents praying quietly at their kitchen tables. The world watches the palace. God works in Bethlehem. And if you feel like your life is a Bethlehem right now, small, quiet, overlooked, unnoticed, listen carefully. That's exactly where God started the biggest story in human history. Don't despise the small. Don't despise the quiet. Don't despise the plain house on the plain street in the plain town. That may be exactly where the star is pointing. Now let's do something honest. Let's look at what the Star of Bethlehem is not, because there are a lot of ideas floating around that we need to gently clear out. First, the Star of Bethlehem is not proof of astrology. This is important. In the ancient world, astrology and astronomy were tangled together. But the Bible actually warns against astrology in many places. Deuteronomy warns against worshiping the sun, moon, and stars. Isaiah mocks astrologers who claim to predict the future by the sky. So how do we reconcile that with the Magi? Here's the key. The Bible never says the Magi were right to be astrologers. It never says their whole worldview was correct. It never blesses their profession. It simply says that God, in His mercy, met them where they were. God used their attention to the sky to draw them to His Son. But the destination was not the stars. The destination was Jesus. That's important. The star did not save the Magi. Jesus saved the Magi. The star just pointed. No one is saved by a horoscope. No one is saved by a chart. No one is saved by cosmic patterns. We are saved by the person the star pointed to. So if you're tempted to think the Christmas story blesses astrology, read Matthew again. The Magi don't worship the star. They worship the child. Second, the Star of Bethlehem is not proof that the universe revolves around your personal desires. Sometimes, people take this story and turn it into a self-help message. Follow your star. Chase your dream. Believe in the sign meant only for you. But that's not what the Magi were doing. They weren't following a sign meant to make them successful. They were following a sign that led them to worship someone greater than themselves. The Star of Bethlehem is not about self-fulfillment. It's about surrender. The Magi did not lay their gold at their own feet. They laid it at the feet of a king. The whole point of the star was to lead them out of themselves and into worship. Third, the Star of Bethlehem is not just a nice bedtime story. This is a real event connected to real prophecies, in a real place, in a real time in history. Real people traveled real roads. A real king ordered real soldiers to do real evil. A real family really did flee to Egypt. This is not a fairy tale. This is the pivot point of history. B, C, and AD. The entire Western calendar was reorganized around the child that star pointed to. And if that is true, then the Star of Bethlehem is not just something to sing about in December. It is something to reckon with in your life every single day. Because if God really did break into human history in that small town, if He really did send His Son, if He really did lay down His life on a cross, if He really did rise from the dead, then everything in your life changes. Everything you thought was important. Everything you thought was small. Everything you thought was hopeless. It all gets reorganized in the light of that star. Now let's talk about the road home, because there's a detail most people skip. After the Magi worshiped Jesus and gave their gifts, Matthew tells us, they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, and they departed to their own country by another way. By another way. That is one of the quietest but most powerful sentences in the whole gospel. These men did not go back the way they came, because they were not the same men. They had walked into Bethlehem as scholars, seekers, watchers of the sky. They walked out as worshippers of a king. And worshippers do not walk the same paths as they used to. Real encounters with Jesus always change your route. You cannot meet the child in the house and go home the same way. You cannot fall down before the Son of God and get up as the same person. Something in you has to be different. Maybe your priorities, maybe your relationships, maybe your habits, maybe your career, maybe your dreams, maybe just the way you look at strangers. By another way, this is what happens to every person who truly encounters Jesus. Peter left his nets. Matthew left his tax booth. Zacchaeus climbed down from his tree, returned 4 times what he had stolen, and gave away half of everything he owned. The Samaritan woman left her water jar at the well and ran back into the town she had been hiding from. Paul, after meeting the risen Christ, spent the rest of his life traveling in the opposite direction of the one he had planned. Every real meeting with Jesus reroutes you. The Magi went home by another way. They could not return to Herod. They could not go back to the corrupt palace. They could not pretend the child they had seen was just another baby. They had walked into the presence of God in the flesh. And that changes your map. And here's the question worth sitting with. If Jesus is who the Bible says He is, if that star really did lead to God in human skin, why do so many of us go back to Herod? Why do we bow before the child on Sunday morning and then walk home the same road we walked in on, back to the same king we were serving before? There is no such thing as an unchanged Christian. Jesus does not exist in a corner of your life. He sits on the throne of it, or He doesn't sit anywhere at all. The Magi are not just characters in a story. They are a mirror. They are asking us the same question their journey asked them. Now that you've seen, will you go home a different way? Will you live a different way? Will you love a different way? Will you spend your time a different way? Will you use your gold a different way? Let's now zoom out and think about why Matthew tells this story at all. Matthew was writing primarily to a Jewish audience. His gospel opens with a long list of genealogies, connecting Jesus back to Abraham and David. He quotes the Old Testament more than any other gospel. He emphasizes the fulfillment of prophecy over and over. So why does Matthew, of all the gospel writers, choose to spotlight foreign scholars from the East coming to worship Jesus? Because Matthew wants his Jewish readers to feel something uncomfortable. He wants them to see that the Messiah they had been waiting for was not just for them. From the very cradle, Jesus was being worshipped by outsiders, by foreigners, by Gentiles. And by the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus stands on a mountain and says, "Go and make disciples of all nations." That promise doesn't start in the Great Commission. It starts with the Magi. Gentiles were kneeling at the feet of the Jewish Messiah before he could even walk. Matthew is telling his own people, listen carefully. This king is bigger than our borders. He is bigger than our language. He is bigger than our history. He is coming for the whole world. And if you don't recognize him, don't be surprised when foreigners do. That had to be a hard message for some of his first readers. And it is still a hard message today. Because the Star of Bethlehem is a reminder that God's family is bigger than any one culture, bigger than any one nation, bigger than any one skin color, bigger than any one denomination. The Magi did not look like the shepherds. They did not talk like the shepherds. They did not worship the same way the shepherds did before they met Jesus. And yet they knelt in the same house before the same child. And by the standards of heaven, they were now family. That means the Church of Jesus Christ is a very big room. And if we've made our idea of it too small, we're the ones who have narrowed what God intended. The Christmas star shone over a Jewish town, but its light reached across the deserts of Persia, across the borders of empires, and into the courts of kings. It is still shining today, across oceans, across languages, across continents. And everyone who has followed its light has ended up at the same house, kneeling before the same child, laying down their own version of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Let's take a moment to talk about the emotional side of this story, because we've been talking a lot about history, prophecy, and astronomy. But underneath all of it, this is a human story. Imagine Mary. She has been through the most impossible year of her life. An angel appeared to her. She conceived a child. Her fiancé almost left her. She made a long journey to Bethlehem while pregnant. She gave birth in a place not built for it. Shepherds came in the middle of the night talking about angels. She has barely had time to catch her breath. And now, some indeterminate time later, foreign strangers walk into her home. They fall on their faces. They open bags full of treasures. They call her son a king. And she sits there, holding him. Luke tells us earlier in the story that Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. Can you imagine what she was pondering after the Magi left? Her ordinary life had become the center of something cosmic. And yet, in the middle of all that grandeur, she was still just a mother. She still had to feed him. She still had to comfort him when he cried. She still had to teach him to walk. She still had to hold him at night. That is one of the most beautiful mysteries of the Incarnation. That God chose to enter our world through a woman who had to change his diapers. We like to sing about the majesty of it, but we forget the ordinariness of it. And the star hung over both. The star hung over the majesty. The star hung over the ordinariness. The star hung over the miracle. The star hung over the dishes, and that means God's presence is not limited to your dramatic moments. God's presence is also over your ordinary hours. The Star of Bethlehem shone over a mother rocking her baby. That same God is with you when you're rocking yours, or when you're driving home from work, or when you're cleaning up after dinner, or when you're sitting in silence, wondering if anyone sees you at all. The star was never just about kings and scholars. It was also about a young woman in a small house being seen by heaven. Let's also talk about Joseph, because Joseph is quietly one of the strongest characters in the Christmas story. He doesn't speak a single recorded word in the Bible, not one, but he acts over and over in exactly the ways God asks him to. When the angel told him not to be afraid to take Mary as his wife, he obeyed. When the angel told him to flee to Egypt in the middle of the night, he obeyed. When the angel later told him to return to Israel, he obeyed. Joseph is the picture of a quiet, humble, faithful man who does what needs to be done without making a scene. And here's what's striking. Joseph was the one God trusted to protect Jesus. Joseph was the one who packed up his family and ran into the night. Joseph was the one who set up a new life in a foreign country because God said so. Joseph is a reminder that some of God's most important work is done through people you may never hear on a podcast, never see on a stage, never read about in a magazine. Quiet fathers, quiet mothers, quiet grandparents, quiet workers, quiet believers, the men and women who show up, do the right thing, protect what God has entrusted to them, and keep going. Joseph would never have been picked by the world as a hero, but heaven picked him. The star did not just shine over a king, it shone over a stepfather too. Let's also think about the shepherds again, since they are so often confused with the magi in nativity scenes. The shepherds got a different sign, not a star, an angel, and then a whole army of angels. The sky above their fields lit up, and one of the most beautiful lines in the entire Bible was spoken to them. Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Now think about who the shepherds were. Shepherds were not respected in that culture. They lived outside. They smelled like their animals. They were often considered unclean because of their work. Many of them couldn't testify in court because their word was not trusted. And yet, these are the people God chose to announce His Son to first. The Magi got a star that took them a year or more to interpret. The shepherds got angels in their faces the very night Jesus was born, and both were welcomed at the same child. I think God did this on purpose. He did not give the same sign to everyone. He did not treat everyone the same way. He treated everyone with what they needed. The Magi needed a puzzle. Shepherds needed a shout. Some of us are Magi. We come to Jesus through long study, through slow reading, through years of thinking, through gradual conviction. Some of us are shepherds. We get an unexpected moment, a shocking encounter, a night when we didn't expect anything and everything changed. God knows which one you are, and He will send you the sign you need, in the language you can hear. He is not stingy with light. He just gives it in different colors, at different times, in different places, so that everyone who is willing to come can come. Let's also confront one of the hardest truths of this story. Jesus was born into a world that tried to kill him from the very beginning. Before he could walk, Herod tried to end him. Before he could talk, his family had to flee. Before he could preach, he had already lived as a refugee in a foreign land. This is not a bedtime story. This is a war zone, and the Star of Bethlehem shone over that war zone like a signal in the darkness. From the very first moment, Jesus was stepping into a fight because the world was not neutral. It was under the influence of real evil. And evil recognized that this baby was different. Jesus did not come as a king who avoided suffering. He came as a king who walked directly into it. And this is important because a lot of people today want Jesus to be like a gentle Santa, a comforting figure who never disturbs anything. But the Jesus of the Bible disturbed everything. He disturbed Herod at his birth. He disturbed the temple in his ministry. He disturbed the Roman Empire in his death. And he disturbed death itself in his resurrection. The Star of Bethlehem was not just announcing a birth. It was announcing an invasion of light into darkness, an invasion of hope into despair, an invasion of mercy into a world drowning in cruelty. And every time someone reads this story with an open heart, that same invasion happens in their own life. So if the Star of Bethlehem is making you a little uncomfortable, that's fine, because it should. It is not a soft light. It is a piercing light, and it shines into every corner we have tried to keep hidden. Let's take a breath and think about what this story means for a person who is struggling right now. Because a lot of people watching this may not be sitting in a peaceful moment. Maybe you're grieving, maybe you're afraid, maybe you're broke, maybe you're sick, maybe you're lonely, maybe you feel forgotten, maybe you're wondering if there is any light at all in your sky. Hear this. The Star of Bethlehem shone over more than just wise men. It shone over a young couple with no money, no home, and no idea what tomorrow would bring. It shone over a small town that had been forgotten by empires and history. It shone over shepherds who thought they didn't matter. It shone over exiles far from home. It shone over refugees fleeing in the night. It shone over a mother who was probably scared out of her mind at times. And that same God who put that light in that sky sees you now. Your Bethlehem may be small. Your story may feel forgotten. Your circumstances may look like a barn. But God started the greatest story of history in a place just like that. And He can start a new story in your life too. If He could turn a stable into a birthplace of hope, He can turn your kitchen table, your hospital bed, your prison cell, your empty living room, your broken family, your lonely apartment, your unemployment line, your addiction recovery, your grieving heart into a place where Jesus meets you. The star is still speaking. It says, look up. It says, don't give up. It says, the King has come, and He is not too proud to enter the room you are sitting in right now. There is one more thought I want to share before we wrap this up. It's about how this whole story ends, because the story of the Star of Bethlehem does not really end in Bethlehem. It does not end at the manger. It does not end when the Magi go home. It continues through the life of Jesus. It continues through His teaching, His miracles, His crucifixion, His resurrection. And it continues through the church, through the ages, through the missionaries who carried the gospel to new lands, through the ordinary Christians who lived quiet lives of faith in small towns nobody remembers. And the Bible tells us it will end with another sign in the sky. Jesus said in Matthew 24, "And then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." The story that began with a star in the sky will end with a sign in the sky. The story that began with a hidden king in a small house will end with a returning king seen by every eye, and every human being who has ever lived will know who he is. So the Star of Bethlehem is not just a memory. It is a preview. It is a whisper of a much greater appearing to come. And the question the Magi answered 2,000 years ago is the same question every one of us has to answer today. When you see the sign, will you follow it? Will you get up? Will you leave the comfortable room? Will you cross the desert? Will you kneel? Will you give? Will you worship? Because there is still time. And the same God who spoke to Gentiles through a star, spoke to shepherds through angels, spoke to fishermen through a carpenter, spoke to a thief on the cross through mercy, and is still speaking to you and me today through his word, is still saying, "Come. All who are weary, come. All who are burdened, come. All who are lost, come. All who are broken, come. And don't just come. Come and worship. Come and give. Come and be changed. Come and go home by another way." So here is where we are. We started with a mystery, a star that moves, a star that stops, a star that leads foreigners to a Jewish baby in a small town. And we've walked through the biblical account, the historical background, the possible astronomy, the cultural setting, and the deeper meaning. And here is what I want you to leave with. The Star of Bethlehem was not a lucky coincidence. It was God speaking. It was God using the sky. It was God using ancient prophecies. It was God using foreign scholars. It was God using a young mother and a quiet stepfather. It was God using a small town that had been overlooked for centuries. It was God weaving together astronomy and prophecy and history and family and politics and faith into one moment. And the point of that moment was not the star. The point of that moment was the child. The point of the sky was the manger. The point of the light was the life. And that same Jesus, born in Bethlehem, is still on the throne today. He is still calling seekers from far countries. He is still meeting shepherds on cold nights. He is still finding refugees in foreign lands. He is still walking into small towns and forgotten homes and lonely hearts. And he is still saying, "Come and worship." So, if you have never really followed the star to Jesus, this may be your moment. Not to admire him from a distance like a decoration on a Christmas card, but to kneel down, lay something at his feet, and let him become your king. And if you have already followed the star to him, the Magi still have a question for you. Are you going home by another way? Because the child in the house is not just something to visit once a year. He is someone to follow every day. The star has done its job. It has led you to Jesus. Now, what will you do with him? And here is the final quiet thought I want to leave with you tonight. The sky the Magi looked up at is the same sky over your house. The same stars they saw are the same stars still spinning slowly above us right now. The same constellations, the same planets, the same moon. And yet, the light that mattered most in their story is not up in the sky anymore. That light came down. That light took on flesh. That light walked among us. That light died on a cross. That light rose from a tomb. That light now lives in every heart that opens to him. So when you step outside tonight and look up, remember, the star led to a person. And that person is still with us. Not far away, not distant, not silent, but as close as a whispered prayer. Jesus, I see you. Jesus, I want to worship you. Jesus, lead me home by another way. That is the prayer of every Magus who has ever followed the star. And it is a prayer God still answers to this day. The Star of Bethlehem was never the point. The child was the point. And the child is now the king. And the king is still calling. And the sky is still bearing witness. And the story is still going. And heaven is still open. And grace is still available. And the road home by another way is still there for anyone willing to take it. So look up. And then, more importantly, look down at the child and lay down your gold, your frankincense, and your myrrh, because you have found him, and he has found you. And the mystery of the star is finally solved. Not by a telescope, not by a chart, not by a scholar, but by a Savior. And his name is Jesus.